the mic work? Yes. Awesome. Cool. Intros. Hey guys, my name is Tamim. I am a solution engineer at RapDev, and I have a super smart architect with me, John.
Yep. Hi guys, I'm John Gyra. I'm a ServiceNow architect at RapDev.
Awesome. So today we're going to be covering some cool stuff around how we're using ServiceNow to really help engineers solve operations problems, right? Anyone here in ops? Anyone work in ops? SREs? Anyone hate getting paged at 2 in the morning to fix something? Cool. So at RapDev, we're a team of SREs and DevOps engineers focused on the ServiceNow platform. So we come from that kind of cloud-native background. We're about 60-ish engineers based in Boston. We work primarily in the ITX space, so think ITAM, ITOM, DevOps, GCP, Azure, et cetera. We really try to focus on that space and try to bring the best practices from the DevOps world over to the ServiceNow platform, hopefully make it easier for engineers to use ServiceNow. One of the big things we're going to touch on is how we want engineers to really leverage the platform without having to log into ServiceNow. Very common theme, I'm sure some of you have heard it, engineers don't want to log into ServiceNow. So that's a common theme we'll be touching on today. For the overview, we were hoping to have someone from SmileDirect with us. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it. Everyone familiar with SmileDirect and what they do? They manufacture teeth dentures, essentially. Great customer out of Nashville, and super progressive. So they do true CI/CD. They deploy 300-400 times a day to production. We deployed Discovery for all of their machines on the manufacturing plant, so really cool use case. None of it was out of box, none of it had patterns, all custom machinery. And the problem they had is, like I was saying earlier, their engineers did not want to log into ServiceNow, but they pumped all of their data into ServiceNow, they pumped all their events into ServiceNow. Before doing that, they were getting about 400-ish, 400,000 alerts a month, and we were able to condense that way down. So that's what we're going to be walking through today. John's probably going to run you through the overview and how we solved it.
Yeah. So when we went into SmileDirect, they were getting a lot of different events coming into ServiceNow. They were also getting a lot of different false positives. They had PagerDuty. A lot of people were being woken up during the night. Just a lot of things. They weren't able to correlate events, especially with them being in that cloud ephemeral world. And basically, they had sources coming in from AWS, Datadog, SolarWinds. There's really no good way to correlate, all these different events coming in together. And one of the biggest things is, coming into ServiceNow in the event management module, there was no sort of static CIs to actually bind all these events to, because usually these events were tied to, these EC2s that lived inside of AWS, Kubernetes pods, whenever containers go down, all that type of stuff.
Yeah, so who here is starting to adopt CSDM or familiar with CSDM? Huge transformation in that space is we're starting to see that you're no longer thinking of your assets as CIs in the event space. You're thinking of them as services. And these services are agnostic of the infrastructure that runs them. These services are the 4 golden signals that Google uses, SRE uses, you might be familiar with them, right? Response time, failure rate, there's a couple more, something like latency is one, I can't remember the 4th. But those are the 4 metrics that apply to your services. Because these containers are scaling up and down all the time, especially in a B2C type business where at noon you might have an influx of users, you can no longer try to attach single CIs and bind them to your events. It's a real big challenge, and the way we're solving that is through services, service IDs, tags, and we'll get into that next.
Yeah. So what we ended up doing at SmileDirect, one of the first things we implemented is the tag-based service mapping. So this ties really into us keeping developers out of ServiceNow, but having that crucial information for their services inside of the CMDB. So with this, we aligned to the CSDM 4.0, because with SmileDirect, they were leveraging microservices for a lot of their different infrastructure. So with a now.yaml, it's really just a YAML file, configuration file that lives inside of their source code repos that they're using for one of their microservices. And based off of the schema that they define there, they can make any changes that will get sent into ServiceNow, and we do logic on our end to go ahead and create the SDLC components, which represents the microservice, and also have that related down to the operational tag-based application services. And one of the important things here is this is all developer-driven, they go ahead and generate a GUID, and that becomes their service ID. And along the lines of creating those tag-based application services, we store that service ID on that application service. And that is going to be utilized later when events are pumping in. And one of the other things with SmileDirect is they really didn't have a standardized enterprise tagging strategy. So the 3 tags that we think are the most important that we suggested they go ahead and do is service ID, so that when events come in, it has the service ID on it. We can go ahead and correlate it in event management. Environment, because for the tag-based application services, they were all delineated by the environment, prod, UAT, dev, et cetera, and the owner. So in the case of whenever we try to do auto remediation, that fails or something else happens, the appropriate person can go ahead and get paged accordingly. Now, in order to also get different data inside of the CMDB, we also implemented event-based discovery. Mainly, we did it with AWS, using AWS config to SNS, to get more real-time updates into the CMDB. But then we also did, the regular scheduled discovery, probably like once a day. And I think the most important thing there is using assume role discovery, because there is the credential, having an access key, secret key ID. Those always have to be rotated. Assume role is just a lot better solution for that.
Yeah. So the main takeaways, right, is you need a standard tagging strategy. Super, super, super important. If you're doing stuff in the cloud, you probably already have it. If you're provisioning using Terraform, using Ansible, any of the modern tool sets, it's very likely your cloud team already has a tagging strategy in place, and that's what we utilize to do event-based, tag-based event management. You can't really do it without a really solid tagging strategy. And then the second most important thing is leave your developers out of ServiceNow. Leave your engineers outside. Don't force them to log in. Don't force them to fill out forms. Don't force them to use Operator Workspace. They don't want to do that. The way to do it is a YAML file, right? So if you look on the left, it's a very standard YAML file. If you're familiar with YAML, the developer defines all the content, right? This is super important because a developer can do this by committing code to a Git repo. The DevOps module in ServiceNow, part of ITSM Pro, automatically hooks into all your repos and pulls that data in. And then we have ingesters that transform this payload into a service. So if the user doesn't define the service correctly, the user does not benefit from the CSD, the CMDB and the CSDM. It's really up to the developer to do this. And this is infinitely better than telling an engineer, hey, by the way, when you start working on a new microservice, please log into ServiceNow and please remember to fill out a form and please make sure the form is correct, because they're not going to do that, right? Everyone's dealing with it. Nobody's going to go sideways into service to do that. So what we've done is the now.yaml now becomes a standard metadata file, part of every single microservice that gets defined, right? If you guys are familiar with how that works, whenever you define new repo, there's a set of templates or files that are provisioned with that microservice. Could be pipelines, CI/CD pipelines, could be metadata about the service. In this case, we've also added now.yaml. Anytime a new microservice gets worked on, you get a now.yaml, and that now.yaml gets hooked up to ServiceNow, and it immediately defines the service with the correct tags. And now if you're sending events from Datadog, SolarWinds, wherever you're sending events from observability tools, it's going to correlate that because you've already defined the service with the right tag, right? So that's how we're solving that particular problem. It's not realistic anymore to say, I'm going to try to bind every container to a service. That's just not going to happen. It's way too dynamic of an environment.
Yep.
Cool.
So once we have the now.yaml defined, we have the services, we have the service ID on there, we have a good foundation, so then when events actually get pumped into ServiceNow, we can correlate them correctly. And the big thing with having a lot of things in the cloud environment, not all events are alerts. Containers get spun up and down a lot based off of workload. There's other types of events there. And this goes ahead and instead of trying to bind to those typical infrastructure CIs, which is traditionally how event management has been done, we go ahead and do it directly to that application service based off of that service ID. Because when they going ahead and setting up their templates for their containers, other cloud infrastructure, all of those things will have the service ID on it, and their event sources, AWS, Datadog, will have that coming into ServiceNow. So we set up accordingly the event rules and going ahead to bind to that CI. One of the other important things that actually came out in San Diego that we were able to utilize is the tag-based alert clustering. So also within the ephemeral world, just say the Docker host actually goes down, but there's actually a lot of different containers on there. You could have a lot of different monitors set up, just for watching, just say, any number of containers. You might get a lot of different events that are really from the same root cause. And what you're able to do with tag-based alert clustering is actually define, what set of tags that you're looking for. And, in our case, it was the service ID. If you have multiple events coming in that has a service ID tag, and they're all for the same value, what it will do is automatically do a grouping of alerts. So you have that primarily alert group and all your secondary alerts. Because before this, they're basically just going to be all separate ones. There was no good way to correlate that. So that was definitely something plus that came out of San Diego. And one of the other things that we were able to do here, especially in this cloud ephemeral world, is being able to do some auto remediation. Looking at the actual event body, what was actually the cause of this event. One of the main ones that we did with SmileDirect is dealing with AWS ECS. So when we ever see something go down, we can automatically try to go ahead and start that task or a service. And with this, the alert will automatically get closed out. No one actually has to get paged. There's no manual intervention there.
Yeah. So just to add to that, right? If you get the plumbing right, if you get the event rules right, if you get the Yaml files right, this is super scalable. You don't need a ServiceNow admin to keep adding event rules because you're essentially keying off the same tag keys, right? So as long as the developer identifies a value for their service, for the service ID, you no longer have to go in and manage all the different event rules and flapping and all that stuff because the plumbing is the same. The plumbing is keying off a single tag. The tag is a variable that comes from the YAML, right? So once you get this, the silos, sorry, the repos done correctly, you get the event rules done correctly, anytime an engineer adds a service, it automatically starts to correlate events through tag-based correlation in San Diego. Super powerful, you guys should check it out. But it makes the scalability of the platform itself so much easier. You don't need to go back and keep updating as users start sending more events in. Another slide I like a lot, and for those of you that have seen us present before, I had different variations of this, but the most important thing is if you look to the left, right, you got your major incident, your ops, and you got your developers on the left. The most important thing here is the developers are not interacting with the platform directly. They're interacting with the platform through different tools. They might be interacting through Azure, through New Relic, or Lightstep, Datadog, their pipelines, right, ADO pipelines, Ops Genie, and now there's it's a Lightstep incident response is another replacement for PagerDuty. If you guys haven't seen it, you should try it out. I think it's still free. I don't know, is it still free? It was free for a while, yeah. Super good replacement for PagerDuty. And Slack. So the takeaway is, and bidirectional, right? This is all it's not just inbound. If you need something from the platform needs to be able to message us back out to developers. As incident managers or operators, we leverage the platform heavily, right? Operator workspace, major incident management, et cetera. But developers don't want anything to do with it. And we have to acknowledge that and we have to cater to them. Otherwise, they're just not going to get us the data we need and they're not going to get the value from the platform. So super, super important to let the developers stay in their tools and not force them into the platform. So what did we end up with? So are you doing this or am I doing this? I'm doing this. So what did we end up with? Before any of the tangible results, it's credibility, it's buy-in, right? You can't force, it can't be a top-down. Like those days are gone. It's going to be a bottoms-up adoption. When one engineering team or two engineering teams realize that it's actually pretty easy and it's doable, the adoption spreads. And this is the same thing you see with any bottoms-up approach in the tech world, right? You can put a credit card into AWS and start using it. You can put a credit card into any observability tool, start using it. It's the same exact thing. When engineers understand that this is actually pretty simple and it works and it makes life better, it just starts, the adoption spreads, right? So you got to get that bottoms-up adoption. False positives were reduced from 40,000 events a month down to 200, right? Not because we're great and we're geniuses and we do really good work, just because we're correlating off of service IDs that actually simplify the whole process. You want to get out of the business of CI binding, get out of the business of trying to understand how many containers run this platform. It doesn't matter. The service is a service, right? If you use the combination of tags, what's the service ID? Is it prod, dev? What do you care about, right? Who's the owner? Those are all tags that live in your YAML. As long as you lean on those, the plumbing becomes so simple and the scalability becomes super, super easy, right? So by leveraging the tag grouping in San Diego, we were able to really, really condense all those events. Obviously, we didn't wake up at 2 in the morning to solve a problem. You're a lot happier. I think any engineer would attest to that. But the takeaway from all this really is keep your engineers out of the platform and leverage all the new functionality that's coming out to interact with the platform from external tools, right? The ephemeral space around ServiceNow is growing. There's a ton of outbound stuff through Integration Hub, but there's also a ton of inbound stuff that's starting to happen through ADO, Git tools, Slack, Teams, right? A lot of in and out chat ops. So that's really the biggest thing here. I think that's our last slide. Is that right? Yes, it is our last slide. Thank you guys for having us. We have 6 minutes left on the counter. Is there any questions anyone might have that we can answer? We tried to keep it super short. Don't be shy. We like questions.
So how do you read the now.yaml? Do you have to use like the DevOps module, or does it incorporate Swiggle, anything like that?
Great question. So Swiggle, Swiggle is now DevOps config. So you want to take the now.yaml? You want to answer that?
Yeah.
And we'll get into Swiggle.
Yeah. So I'll take the first part.
He built the now.yaml.
Yeah. So with the now.yaml, basically we have 2 different versions, depending on if the customer actually is leveraging DevOps. Obviously, we would prefer the customer to actually leverage DevOps, because you also have the DevOps data model, you have repositories that we can tie into. You actually can see where a tag-based service actually lives, all that stuff. But in essence, they'll define the now.yaml. It does a webhook into ServiceNow. In any case, it's basically just an API, and we also built a YAML to JSON converter, because inside of ServiceNow, you can't really work with YAML very well, but you can very easily work with JSON objects. So once we have that JSON object, we can implement any sort of mapping that we have. We have a standard set of what things should be mapped to, but every customer's use case is different. So we can go ahead and map that accordingly to the correct CSCM classes, and we have the core entities that they want mapped, name, environment, all these different things. But there may be other items that they want to find there. We can easily map that up as well.
And a lot of this is open source, by the way. We open source a lot of our work. I keep getting caught on my wire. We open source a lot of our stuff, so if you jump on GitHub and look for our repo, there's a lot of update sets. I think the YAML to JSON converter is open source.
Yeah, the YAML to JSON converter is actually on the ServiceNow store, and it's free too. So
there's a lot of stuff we throw up there that might be helpful, so just definitely check that out. Swiggle, for those not familiar, Swiggle was acquired by ServiceNow about a year ago-ish. Just got re-platformed San Diego, now called DevOps Config. And it's essentially a way to enforce configurations on CI/CD pipelines. So think you're modifying a SQL file like a my.conf, and you want to make sure you're using port 3382, or you want to use whatever SQL port you're enforcing. You set up those rules, or you're using TLS transfer. You set up those rules in ServiceNow, and when the pipeline runs, it checks against all those rules, and if they're not right, it'll pause the pipeline. So we did not use DevOps config for this particular use case. We've used it for other use cases. But it's a really good way to enforce configuration. It's kind of like a Sentinel for the Hashi stack in a way, but it's on the pipeline side. It's not on the actual config posture side.
So with your guys' CIs, new CIs coming in, your YAML, does it automatically go in and create the CMDB? And then also
exactly
vice versa. If people are decommissioning systems, do you guys use that YAML file to move it out of production?
There's a state value in the YAML file, and the state could be, so the most important thing, and we were talking to someone about this last night, you have to enable the engineers, and you have to manage the structure of the data as early on as possible. Otherwise, you're going to be in the business of cleaning up your CMDB, and you don't want that, right? So you need to give the customer feedback on whether their YAML passed or not. So we do that either through email or through adding comments to the YAML file itself. At the bottom, last run was this date, and the result was success or fail, and why it failed. The state of the service is just another key in your YAML. It could be, when you start building it, it's not in prod yet, right? It's not active, it's in dev, or whatever. When it goes to prod, you flip it from dev to prod, or dev to active, or whatever you want to call it. And that just switches the state in the CMDB. And if you're missing fields, you could define mandatory fields in CMDB. If you're missing them, this won't make it in. So you're not going to have trash in, trash out. It'll only make it in if everything is met and compliant, and then the developer gets that feedback. But you don't want to be in the business of cleaning your CMDB out. Nope. Nobody does.
All right, thanks, guys.
Yep.
For the new services that get created from the YAML files, I'm imagining you created like a custom table and extended it off one of the CI classes? Or
No.
No.
Do that.
We conform to the CSDM. So the main thing there is registering microservices, and you actually can see part of that YAML file there. At the top level is business applications, because you want to start inside the business application. From there, it goes down into the SDLC component, which is the microservice. That's part of the new CSDM 4.0. And then under that, basically where they list out the different environments that they have. Basically, just every different environment is just a representation of that microservice for that environment. So we are using the out-of-box tables in accordance with the CSDM. Nothing custom there.
Think of this as a replacement for a form in a service catalog, in a portal. Instead of going to a portal to fill out a form, you define a YAML in a repo and bring it in. None of this, you don't want to modify any of your CMDB tables or extend them. It's all out of box.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Question in the back. We have 43 seconds. Now 37.
Yeah. Do you have to write, I guess, based on the application you have, do you have to write YAML for each application for the, for the service mapping? Okay.
It's very common in the DevOps world to have multiple declarative files in each repo that define a microservice.
Yeah.
And those declarative files could be like a Jenkins file or a YAML for your pipeline, CI/CD pipelines. It could be a declarative file to define the service. So it's not uncommon that you have the now.yaml and many other files in every single repo as you build out your microservices. So now.yaml is just one more declarative file in the service.
Okay, and one more question. So does it also create CIs in CMDB for all the, I guess, configuration items? Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, so the main ones that we deal with are in accordance with the CSDM. So we have the business application, from there the SDLC components, and then we deal with the tag-based application services. And it will also tie into, based off of the tags that are defined there, if you are doing discovery of your cloud environments, virtualization, because those have tags as well. Anything that it discovers there that has the same set of tags will go ahead and get mapped in. It's basically kind of like Smee was saying, no one has to go into ServiceNow to actually do it, because right now inside of ServiceNow, in order to set up tag-based service mapping, you have to define the categories, you have to define families, all that stuff. With this, all that is automated, no one has to do it, and again, once whatever they define there, they discover it, it automatically gets mapped up.
And we're out of time. Right?
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
to
you
both
guys.
of
If any
you for this
questions, we'll be here.
presentation.